Building the file at some point, the story stopped living only in my body and started living in paper. That was another kind of shift. Before then, most of what I knew was experiential. I knew what I could and could not eat. I knew what hurt. I knew what I had been avoiding, what had gotten worse, and how much energy it took just to function around it. I knew the difference between surviving and actually being okay. But once I understood that this case was going to depend on proof, not just truth, I realized I needed more than my own experience. I needed a record. I needed a structure. I needed a file. So I started building one. At first, I do not think I fully understood how much labor that would become. It sounds simple when you say it quickly. Gather records, get letters, organize documents, submit what is needed. But in real life, especially when you are already unwell, building a file is not a neutral administrative task. It is emotional. It is physical. It is cognitive. It asks you to revisit the hardest parts of your own life and sort them into something legible enough for strangers to interpret. It also asks something deeply unnatural of a sick person. It asks you to become orderly while you are living through disorder. I began pulling records from different places: medical notes, visit summaries, test results, treatment plans, anything that showed not only that I needed help, but why I needed it and what would happen if I did not get it. I was no longer looking at documents as isolated medical artifacts. I was looking at them as pieces of a chain. I needed one record to support another. I needed them to talk to each other. I needed the file to tell a story that no single page could tell alone. That was when I started noticing how systems often fail people with complicated lives. Not because the evidence does not exist, but because the evidence is scattered. One office has one part. Another provider has another. One note shows symptoms. Another shows consequences. Another shows history. Another shows proposed treatment. But unless somebody takes the time to gather those fragments and place them next to each other, the larger truth can stay invisible. That somebody became me. I had to learn how to think like a person, building a case, instead of a person, simply living inside one. I needed records that showed the treatment being recommended. I needed records that showed the medical context underneath it. I needed records that showed the functional impact. I needed evidence of pain, nutritional problems, digestive instability, and the way one issue was aggravating another. I needed the kind of documentation that could turn a misunderstood problem into a coherent medical narrative. And I needed it all while I was still tired, still hurting, still trying to eat, still trying to hold daily life together. That is one of the things people rarely see. They see a packet later and think, there, the documents are organized. But they do not see the hours of searching, requesting, downloading, printing, nomming, comparing, rereading, and second-guessing that went into that stack. They do not see how many times you wonder whether something is important enough to include, whether one phrase matters more than another, whether the record you need is buried in a portal you can barely navigate, whether you are missing the one page that would make the whole story click. Paperwork starts to feel less like paper and more like a second body you have to carry. There was also something more vulnerable about it than I expected. Building the file meant seeing my own life reflected back at me through other people's language. Symptoms turned into summaries. Pain became chart notes. Weight changes became numbers. Fear became shorthand. Whole chapters of struggle were compressed into clinical phrases. It is a strange and disorienting thing to watch your life translated that way. Necessary, yes, but strange. And still, I kept going, because by then I understood what was at stake. I knew that if the file stayed incomplete, the story could be made smaller. If the context stayed scattered, the case could be made simpler than it really was. And if the file told the wrong story, or only half of the right one, then the outcome could be shaped by a misunderstanding I had failed to correct in time. That pressure changed the way I moved through everything. I stopped seeing follow-up as optional. I stopped assuming that what I sent was automatically attached where it needed to be. I stopped assuming that one department knew what another department was doing. I started paying attention to what kind of process something belonged to, what kind of language was being used, and whether the explanation I had given was actually the explanation the file seemed to reflect back. That was exhausting, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of strength. Not the kind of strength people like to romanticize. Not bravery in the dramatic sense, something quieter, more practical. The kind of strength that shows up when a person realizes no one else is going to hold the thread of the story unless they do it themselves. So I held it. I kept gathering. I kept organizing. I kept trying to turn chaos into a sequence, pain into documentation, and lived experience into a record strong enough to travel through a system that did not know me and was not going to assume the best on its own. That work changed the relationship I had to my own case. It was no longer just something happening to me. It was something I was actively trying to shape, protect, and articulate. Every new document became a chance to tighten the narrative. Every clarified point became a way of pulling the truth back into focus. The file became not only a record of what had happened, but a defense against how easily the story could be distorted. And the more I built it, the more I saw the deeper unfairness hiding underneath it all. A person should not have to become this good at documentation just to be understood. A person should not have to become their own case manager while they are also still living with the condition in question. A person should not need to assemble their life like evidence just to persuade a system that the suffering in front of it is real, connected, and consequential. But that is what happened. And as hard as it was, building the file taught me something I would not forget. If I could learn how to do this for myself, maybe one day I could help someone else do it before they felt as lost as I had. At the time, that thought was only beginning, more instinct than plan. A quiet sense that this much struggle had to mean more than just surviving it alone. But first, I still had to get the file in front of the right people, and that was when the next part of the story began.